And at the moment, I'm not even thinking about one state, from the river to the sea, the Hamas style or a secular style. I'm thinking about really, I mean, I would never have imagined that I would be such a staunch defender of international law. But to me, really, this is where we have to go back. I mean, when we think of justice, there are 28 resolutions. We have to start from there. Otherwise, again, you know, we have to start going back to the meanings of war, because I think the attack is so deep. As I tried to explain, the attack is about sort of we are going through a phase where there is no meaning attached to words anymore. And therefore, I think that if there is something that has been the result of decades of building consensus around at least the idea that every life should be valued. I mean, this is it's always been under threat, because colonialism was about how not true that statement is. But I think that's what we need to aim for, to make that statement valuable, and therefore, that I believe that whenever we speak about peace, we have to say that it needs to be just. And in this context of erasure and attack, it has to be rooted in the international law, in my view, and then start building from there.
Well, I wrote a book called Impossible Peace, so I guess I wouldn't be so supportive of using the word. Obviously, peace without justice usually occurs in cemeteries, you know, where it's very quiet because everyone's already dead. So I think you're right. Justice seems even more impossible than peace, but is more necessary. And I think this horrible month and a half reminds us that the only thing worse than international law is when there's no international law. And then everyone just kills with complete abandon. And whoever can get away with it gets away with it, whoever can't is buried in the rubble. So I think this reminds us that international law matters. It has to actually be enforced. And if we don't enforce it here, this utter impunity by the powerful nations will just keep spreading. The happiest person in the world right now with what's going on in Palestine is Modi, is the Indian Prime Minister, who most of you may not follow what's happening in India. He actually has put up memes of him single-handedly shooting Hamas, taking on and fighting Hamas. He loves what's happening. That's a country of 1.4 billion people, right? Where that has demonized Islam and Muslims, and where he's substituting himself for Israel and Hamas for Indian Muslims, and of course breaking all kinds of law, international humanitarian and human rights law. And it just goes on. And like I said, I think it's a prelude to a global situation that, you know, Gaza is going to be coming to everyone at some point. So even if you don't particularly care about Gaza, you're going to be living it if we don't stop this insanity now. So I do agree and the first place we could stop is international law. And that's very difficult because the whole setup of the UN is that international law only gets made when the Security Council decides it, and because of the permanent veto that the US has and the other 4 members of the Security Council, they can all stop any resolution that might challenge them or force them or their client states to stop. But there are moves underway to overcome that through a larger General Assembly resolution. It's a structural problem of the UN, but something needs to be done soon to change that dynamic, because if there's no way to render international law about this, then it's just going to spread like a cancer everywhere.
Sorry.
Thank you all for, we conversation. I just wanted to say, I'm a PhD student who also works with archives, and one dilemma I always have when I'm sitting in an archive is the knowledge that of all the things it does not contain. And so I wanted to ask, like in this moment, when contending with the genocide in Gaza, and all the families that were erased from the registry, and just like all the histories that are completely eradicated, how do we grapple with the weight of this absence, this violent absence, in trying to document this moment? And in general, like in thinking of all the absence that an archive contains as much as the things that an archive contains. Thank you.
Yes, but I just wanted to say a couple of words on which you have commented and questions. Just a couple of words, you know. I totally agree with you. There is a slogan that is very dear to me: no justice, no peace. It's a slogan that in my memory is connected to the uprising in LA in 1992, but has more general significance. You were mentioning the movement for peace in Vietnam. I think it is also important to remember another movement that was maybe even wider from a global point of view, which means the movement against the war in Iraq in 2003. February 15, 2003 has been a day of mobilization at the global level, involving tens of millions of people. And that was a movement against a specific form of war, not only a specific war, but a specific form of war, which means a war against rogue states, a war led by the lonely superpower at the margins of the system. But nowadays we are confronted with kind of different wars. If you think of the war in Ukraine, I mean, it's a war that pits Russia against NATO, against the US, that pits two nuclear power against each other. And I think this is an important difference, also from the point of view of the ways in which we imagine and build a politics against the war, first of all, you know. Ruba was saying, speaking of Gaza, Palestinians want to live, you know, in front of the specter of a nuclear war. We all want to live. This does not mean that peace becomes a value in itself, but there is a shift. You know, if you think of kind of potential proliferation of wars of this time, of course, Taiwan is the obvious instance of a potential conflict. But I think there are also connections to be investigated between the Ukraine war and what is happening in Gaza. You know, the kind of intensity of the war against Palestinians has something to do with a new global scenario in which war is at the center of global processes and of a kind of transition we are living through, because it's of course important to point to international law, but we are all aware, I think, of the limits of international law, of the difficulty of international law to grasp, even conceptually, the situation. I heard international lawyers discussing the war in Gaza and asking the question whether it is to be considered an internal or an external war. Should be kind of basic question from the point of view of international law, but there are international legal scholars who lively discuss this question without finding an agreement. So this is what I mean speaking of a transition in which the war is kind of ghostly and material presence.
Yeah. Just a couple of quick thoughts for you. Thank you so much for that question. The question of how to archive those who have been annihilated is one that has sort of dominated archival studies for a long time. And the Palestinian struggle in some ways is slightly newer than broader struggles throughout the world in the last at least century of more organized archival practices, but also earlier. I mean, medieval historians also think about archives of disappeared peoples and societies and communities. And we can draw from those practices and those experiences. We can draw from historians of enslavement, historians of indigenous societies, historians of, communities, First Nation communities, etc., as well as historians of the working class, historians of, tenement workers in East London can offer us practices to retrieve and recover. But I'm also thinking about the fact that there are now, in Gaza, 100 families that have been completely annihilated. No one from any generation of that family has survived. How do we write the histories of those families? What does it mean to even try to write histories of families that are no longer in the civil registry? And here I want to come up with a couple of initial thoughts, but this is something that I've thought about quite a bit in the last few weeks. And the first is that people are social relations. They don't exist in vacuums. These families and these members of these families had friends, lovers, enemies, classmates, neighbors. We seek them. Their oral histories of those families annihilated will be the first port of call. The second is that, in a sense, they become the priority in any discussion of accountability. And this, I think, goes back to this question of justice. That they are the first testifiers to the depth and the reach of this annihilatory impulse of the Israeli state. That it could be fine with annihilating 100 families off a civil registry. Finally, I think in part of what an archivist must also reckon with is something that Mark Nishamian also, in another from the Armenian genocide, warned us against, which is this historiographical perversion that would demand that we archive everything. I think part of a moment of annihilation is to wrestle with the archives of silence. That there is not everything is retrievable, and in fact our rage and our anger and our demand for justice must come also from those questions that will never have answers. But there's two important pieces to that. First is to always ask, who was that family? What was their story? What did, Ahmed do? What did Zainab do, etc.? And second, it is to never rest with the silence that comes from that end of that question, from there being no answer to that question. The only answer to the question of an archival silence is justice and accountability. Thank you.
Just say very quickly what's being described here is 𝐏𝐿𝐴. It's a term that Professor 𝐏𝐿𝐴 created to describe what the U.S. did in Iraq when it was bombing archives and destroyed untold thousands of documents and a huge, I think almost the entire Ottoman history of Iraq was destroyed by U.S. bombs. And 𝐏𝐿𝐴 was the Greek god of history. So that is not just a crime against humanity, that's genocide. So when you're erasing that many families, you can't, you're simply, it's a factual statement, you're committing genocide. It's not a moral, of course a moral statement, but it's literally a factual statement before anything else. So is there genocide being committed? There's your answer, right? Yeah, again, I mentioned Toni Morrison. She had the idea of remembering, and Saidiya Hartman's idea of critical fabulation. I think these are things that every historian, but especially those from communities that have suffered genocide, have to confront. And but I'm sure also, knowing people in Gaza enough, that those people's histories will not be forgotten, and they will be preserved for the future, because no one understands better than people in Gaza how important it is to do so against the genocide that's happening.
I think that now we can conclude actually this extremely rich and powerful evening. So thank you again to all of you for sharing your thoughts, your research, your analysis, your political visions, your ideas, your thoughts, your reflections, and what Mezna was echoing about also social relations made me thinking about, I think that many of you, because also it widely circulated in Italy, was Facebook status with journalists. We will maybe have history also through social media, from a former student, also a professor from Al-Aqsa University in Gaza, wrote, "If I die, please remember that I studied English a lot, that I loved my studies, that I had many dreams and projects for the future, and that I'm an entire galaxy. I can't remember the proper word, but the sense was I'm in a universe. And this is political, and this is human, and this is social, and this is all that you beautifully and powerfully said tonight. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to the Amilcar Cabral, the library again, all the staff, and to Francesca Biancani for organizing tonight. Thank you, Francesca.